My name is Maxwell Azali. I'm a graduate student at the Coastal Science and Policy Program at UCSC. And I'll be presenting the results from my Capstone project, and I've titled it a bit differently from the title of my Capstone project. So today I'll talk about coral reef conservation in changing climates and human populations. Coral reefs are a source of food. There are about 6 million fishers who have been employed directly in coral reef fisheries. These fisheries are important, especially in developing countries where people depend on them for their livelihoods and their sustenance. And a healthy reef can yield about 0.2 to 40 tons per kilometer squared per year, showing its potential actually for food production and feeding people who depend on them. However, we are losing corals to climate change. As the oceans continue warming, corals lose their symbiotic algae and they become white. And when these conditions of warming persist, corals actually die. And 90%, it is estimated that 90% of the reefs might be lost by 2050 due to the increase in thermal stress. And when we talk thermal stress, we are talking about elevated seawater temperatures. But we also know that climate change will lead to fisheries decline in coral reef areas. And I will show you, and I will show you this yellow box that shows the coral reef region, and where we have a letter A here. This is the Western Indian Ocean region where I come from and where I'll be talking about today. And aside from climate change, we know that human populations are projected to increase at least in the next 30 years, up to 2050, when certain models project there will be a decline. So my interest was to look at how this increasing demand, increasing human populations will lead to increasing demand in coral reef regions, and to look at how this will affect the Western Indian Ocean region where I come from. These patterns have already been registered. We have 70% of the reefs are at risk from bleaching or climate change. There's a high dependence on marine resources and sustenance. People depend on them for their livelihood. And about 60 million people live within 100 kilometers of coastline, depending directly on the marine resources. However, when we come to fisheries management or management of the region, coral reefs in the region, only 2% are in high compliance closures, what you call no-take marine reserves, while an additional 14% are actually low compliance marine reserves. I just want to make that distinction because it will become important as I share my results in the coming slides. And 42%, the 84% is divided equally between openly fished areas. These are areas that do not have any restrictions. And the other one are gear restricted or access restricted areas. So they have some form of restrictions on gears or seasons. So the big idea here was how can we inform strategic conservation using existing data that we have in the Western Indian Ocean region, because you would understand that we did this study at a time where there was a global pandemic. So I thought taking advantage of existing data would be a good way of spending my capstone time. So here is the conceptual model. And on the left, I have climate change. And here from climate change, what I'm meaning here is that I'll use sea surface temperatures. I use sea surface temperature data, both historical and future projections. And the quest here was to convert that into a measure of coral mortality, how climate change will affect coral reefs, and to have that inform us about priority conservation areas. And I also was interested in this other dimension of fisheries demand in terms of growing human populations, how this will affect fish biomass and eventually yield, fisheries yields, and how we can use this information to identify priority conservation areas. And when we begin with quantifying thermal stress, the most common metric that has been used is the degree heat index. This is a graph accessed from the NOAA website for Kenya and where I am. And I will just take you through what it means. So you have a temperature time series, the dark blue line, from January to about January 2021. And for any time series, what you look at the historically warmest month. So you'll see for Kenya, we have April identified as our historically warmest month. And we think the idea here is that corals are adapted to that historically warmest month, but there is a threshold with which if they exceed, now conditions become stressful for them. So we have a bleaching threshold that is identified, and this is about 1 degree above the historically warmest month. And this is how NOAA calculates it. So I'm just going to how NOAA calculates it. And here we have your degree heating mix, and you'll notice that the degree heating mix is the positive differences between your time series, your temperature time series, and the bleaching threshold accumulated over a 3-month period. And now people use degree heating mix to indicate whether conditions are stressful. For example, if the degree heating mix exceed 4, this lower line, then it is thought that that reef is likely to bleach. And when they exceed 8, then you have potential mortality events around coral reef regions. So, however, studies from the region have shown that degree heating mix does not capture the state of the reef well. Sometimes patterns are missed. So there's work by WCS that has shown that the shape of temperature distributions, such as kurtosis and skewness, can actually be used as alternative predictors for bleaching. So going into this project, because I was predicting the future of reefs, I was interested to see how these metrics also compare. So skewness can either be positive, negative, or neutral. And I'm interested in the positive and negative, and you'll see why. So for coral reefs, if this dotted line is the mean, then if you're positively skewed, then this means that you have frequent cooler water events. So the reef is in an environment of cooler waters. And here you have frequent warm water events if the skewness is on the negative side. And then we have kurtosis. And kurtosis, positive kurtosis would mean that you have narrower tolerances you have a narrower temperature range. That's how I interpret it. And negative kurtosis, if you can see the lower graph, would mean that you have a wider tolerance for temperature conditions. So the hypothesis here was that wider tolerances to frequent warm water events might be ideal to coral reefs. And I'll show you how we used now these models, these thermal stress indices, to spatially classify the Western Indian Ocean region. And what we did, I did a principal component analysis of around 7 of these metrics, including our skewness and kurtosis measures, the mean sea surface temperature, the rate of rise of the sea surface temperature. This is from 1985 to 2017. We also calculated the degree heating mix, but in a cumulative fashion. We calculated the bimodality, whether the temperature distribution has 1 peak or 2 peaks, and the standard deviation. And here we were able to uncover 6 clusters. All the reefs in the region clustered into 6 clusters. These are 1,168 reef cells at 2.5 kilometers squared. And they had a gradient of kurtosis from positive kurtosis to positive to negative kurtosis, positive to negative skewness. And this is the resultant map. And you will see that cluster number 6, which was in the Maldives, was associated with frequent cold water events and lower tolerances, while the distributions were more unimodal. And from the coral reef perspective, we think that these conditions might actually be stressful for coral reefs. And but the East African coastline and northwestern Madagascar, as you can see, the red here, had the opposite relationships, which uh, had the opposite relationship, which the distributions were nearby model, but with frequent warm water events and wider tolerances. But cluster number 2 in southwestern Madagascar was bimodal, had frequent cold water events with wider tolerances. So we at least characterized the temperature regimes for the region, and 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 then we used those values now, those temperature metrics, to create a model of coral cover for the region, because I'm interested to know the mortality that is caused by climate change for each coral reef. And here I'll point you out to some of the exciting patterns that we got. One of them was that my hypothesis of kurtosis and skewness being negative kurtosis and negative skewness being ideal for the reef was confirmed, as you can see from the top two panels. And then we had also the relationship between cumulative degree heating weeks and coral cover was also hump-shaped, meaning that and did not follow the pattern that above 8-degree heating weeks, then you get severe coral mortality. That was not confirmed in this study. So meaning that we need to explore these alternative metrics for estimating the future of corals. And the last thing that I would want also to point you out to is this last part here, where we have hard coral cover and fisheries management systems. It was quite surprising that fisheries management was significant in our model. And actually, and as you can see, the fished areas had actually lower biomass relative to when you implement fisheries restrictions. So it's not only temperature, but also human management or human interventions can also offer protection to coral reef ecosystems. And this is just a model now showing you the predictions. On the left here, I predicted coral cover for 2020 using that model of mine. And then we substituted with future values. The thermal stress metrics were substituted with future values to show you the graph on the left of the conditions in 2050. And we see that 13% of the reefs in 2020, you have 13% of the reefs having coral cover below 25%. 25% is thought of as the coral cover that protects, that is able to protect more biodiversity. But when you come to the low emission scenario in 2050, you get that this value now is 45%. And we also saw that there were declines in coral cover across the East African coastline. When you look at the low emission scenario. And I'll just show you now the high emission scenario. And the high emission scenario from 13%, if we do not reduce our emissions, then you have 60% of the region having corals less than 25% by 2050. And we are seeing high declines, especially in Kenya, northern Tanzania, southern and central Mozambique, northern central Madagascar, and Seychelles. And now I will show you one of the challenges that we had, because now we are using skewness and kurtosis, is that there's a weak correlation between these metrics across data sources. And this is from in situ measurements, when you measure the reef with a temperature gauge, when you measure temperature, sea surface temperature with a temperature gauge on the reef, and when you take satellite data from the NOAA model, and when you take global climate models that predict the future, you find that there's a very weak correlation among these metrics. So this was a challenge which I was not able to resolve during the time of my capstone, but it's something that I'll be looking forward to investigating further. And we also developed fish biomass models. And here I used gravity, which is a concept that has been applied to fisheries before by scientists from the University of from Australia, the SINA research group, and coupled that with travel time, which was also developed from there by Meyer et al. 2016. So gravity is the population at the market divided by the square travel time to the reef. So that was my measure of demand. And I did this also for current and future current and future population estimates. And what we are seeing here is that fish biomass reduced at high levels of gravity, like where you have higher presence of populations, high population density, then you expect that the fish biomass will decline. And this pattern was true for fished areas. And I would like to point out that unfished areas that were low compliance, that were not well managed, also had the same linear declining pattern. What was interesting is that gravity, when it interacted with restricted management, you see now that we buy time before the decline starts. And then when you look at high compliance closure, this relationship was not significant, but then it denoted like an increasing relationship, which is opposite from what we expected. So this points out to the idea that high compliance closures have been effective in retaining biomass. And this, I'll just show you the predictions that we had. And from here, you'll see in 2020, looking at 2020 and the high population scenario, in general, there were about 10% declines of biomass, gains or declines of biomass at each reef. If you consider each individual reef, the range of declines or gains were about 10%, but only 22% of the reefs in the region were projected to gain biomass, while 45% of the reefs in the region had biomass below the level that give you the maximum sustainable yield. And I will show you in the next graph what those regions are. You'll see the regions in brown, the brownish color, which have a ratio of biomass relative to the biomass that produces the maximum sustainable yield. You'll think of these as, from a fisheries perspective, you want to get food from the reef. So you get that all these regions that you're seeing in brown, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, these are areas that now are areas to think about effectively managing, because the models show that the biomass levels there will not achieve the maximum sustainable yield. And
Seems we might be having a little bit of technical difficulties, but Maxwell, you're doing great.
Sorry.
Ah, you're back. Perfect.
Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. Sorry for that. Let me just continue. Yeah, reducing local impacts through fisheries resource management may help also reduce climate impacts on reefs. So we also see that well-enforced MPAs were able to protect biomass declines, even with high human populations. And there were also weak correlations between in situ, satellite, and in situ and satellite on skewness and kurtosis measures. And these are my recommendations now for the region, is to increase the compliance of existing closures, especially those low compliance closures, because they have already been set. There's need to have an effort to drive management efforts towards them, and also improve the management of open fished areas. We've seen that even if you restrict certain gears, you're able to prevent biomass declines at least up to some point. It buys us time at least. And then there's a need also to monitor in situ temperatures around reefs, and also to better satellite and global climate model projections to capture the patterns that are actually realized with in situ temperature. If skewness and kurtosis are important measures, then they need to be monitored in a more better way. And then my next steps are actually to disseminate the results of this work to in-country practitioners. These are fisheries managers and coral reef conservationists. and through a number of ways, online meetings that are scheduled to take place later in the year. And regional conferences and workshops for this region are also another avenue for me to share my results, and also to publish my results in a peer-reviewed journal. And I think this will give this work its credibility, and also help me set up my career in coral reef conservation. And sorry. And with that, I would like to thank you all for finding time to attend this talk, and also to my advisors, Professor Mark Carr and Dr. Tim McClanahan from WCS, the Coastal Science and Policy Program, the WCS Graduate Scholarship Program, specifically the INECE African Conservation Scholarship, WCS Marine Program, and special mentions to Dr. Joseph Maina and Dr. Stephanie Diagata, who helped me think through some of this work. Thank you.